This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Our planet in distress. Our survival in danger. Our ambition, curb carbon emissions. To each nation, its own climate action. To each society, its own green ability. What's the state of global warming? Are we getting there? Goals into Ds, zeroing in on cutting carbon emissions, coal use, clean power. China and Europe rising to the challenge of heading off climate disaster. Join CGTN and EURONEWS for a frank exchange on carbon targets, China and Europe going green.
As the crucial COP26 climate conference in Glasgow is underway, almost 200 countries and regions are being asked to show how they really plan to cut greenhouse gas emissions. The commitments they are making will lead to significant changes in our everyday lives. Today, CGTN is partnering with Europe's biggest news channel, EURONEWS, for a panel discussion asking how we can meet carbon targets. This program is part of CGTN's Global Arena series. I'm Tian Wei, and I will be hosting this special program from CGTN headquarters in Beijing, China.
And I'm Jeremy Wilkes, science correspondent at EuroNews, hosting this discussion from our global headquarters in Lyon, France. This is a unique international collaboration between our channels, a rare chance for you to hear voices from the East and the West on the challenges ahead to slash carbon emissions and to slow the pace of global warming.
As the world's largest developing country, China faces very serious challenge in achieving the stated goal of reaching carbon neutrality by 2060. Meanwhile, the European Commission is aiming to cut greenhouse gas emissions by 55% by the year 2030 and wants to make Europe the first climate-neutral continent by 2050.
Political leaders often point to the COVID pandemic response as evidence that we can make rapid changes when the pressure is high. And the pandemic showed that focused government funding can accelerate the deployment of life-changing technology.
So, what can we do now? How can Europe and China live up to the objectives of Paris Agreement? What system changes need to put in place, and what has proven to be effective so far? Let's introduce our guests. Joining us at CGTN are Zhang Jianyu, the Executive Director of the BRI Green Development Institute, and Wu Changhua, Director of China Asia Office of Jeremy Rifkin.
Here at EuroNews, we are pleased to welcome Diana Urgevosats, Professor at the Central European University in Budapest and Vice Chair of the IPCC Working Group 3, and AJ Gambier, Senior Research Fellow at the Grantham Institute for Climate Change and the Environment at Imperial College London. Welcome to you all.
Welcome, everyone. I would throw the first question directly to Mr. Zhang Jianyu. Why? China is looking at things in two steps, 2030, 2060, when most countries, particularly developed countries, claiming 2050 already reaching carbon neutrality. China is talking about 2060. Why?
Well, I think China is taking a very practical and also methodical approach to this because China is the largest developing country in the world. And to bear in mind, the most important step that many other developed countries have already reached decades ago is peaking that China has yet to achieve. Chinese government made the pledge by President Xi Jinping on September 22nd, 2020, that China will strive to achieve peaking first before 2030. I really want to emphasize that. and then carbon neutrality by 2060. Actually, if you run the math, you will find that that 2060 commitment itself is bold already.
For now, I want to throw it back to my colleague Jeremy. He will ask a wonderful question also to other panelists.
Thank you, Wei. Yes, I wanted to put a question to Diana, which is about this idea of carbon neutrality. Do we absolutely have to have carbon neutrality? Is that the goal, the only goal that we can set?
Well, certainly not the only goal, but I'm afraid we do have to set a carbon neutrality goal, and that's non-negotiable. As the recent report of the UN Climate Panel, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, stated and reinforced that stabilizing the climate at any level requires us to go to net zero carbon dioxide emissions, and we probably have to reduce other greenhouse gases also radically. That means that even if we give up, let's say, the 1.5 degree target, even the 2 degree, even any degree target we want to reach, that means that we have to go to net zero carbon dioxide emissions. So unfortunately, basically the message is that in the long term, if humanity wants to survive, we have to give up using fossil fuels and anything that emits major amounts of carbon dioxide, yes.
Well, Changhua, for China, it's not about talking, it's about acting. And now we know the latest plan for how to implement 2030-2060 already out to the public. What do you make of that plan? How do you see that step by step?
Fascinating and also timely to see the national government released officially an integrated plan. It's ambitious, as Jianyu mentioned early on. It's bold and ambitious, but also very practical, very specific in terms of details. Now we have a few things. One, actually, the targets, the time-bound targets, and using the 2025, 2030, and the 2060. So besides the capping targets, as well as carbon neutrality targets, we have some other evidence or data or quantitative targets to really deliver the bigger agenda there. For instance, energy intensity, carbon intensity, total energy consumption controls, and they are specifically in there. And so now, besides the capping and the carbon neutrality, now we have, for instance, by 2025, and the government targeting achieving carbon intensity target reduction by another 18% over this 5-year period, and energy intensity targets reduction actually by 13.5%. And non-fossil fuels is another major target actually to deliver the bigger carbon neutrality agenda. So by 2025, it's going to be 20% of China's primary energy structure. By 2030, it will be 25%, and by 2060, and fossil fuels actually, particular coal, and will be cutting down by to probably less than sort of 20%. So non-fossil fuel energy will be getting to at least at 80%, even above. So you started to see the integrated national strategy to deliver.
Diana and Changhua have already brought it up, AJ, the question of getting rid of fossil fuels. And at the moment, from where I sit here in France, I basically see several options in terms of renewables. That's wind and solar, and I also see nuclear on the table as well. When it comes to renewables, which are the ones that we know are socially acceptable everywhere, is that really the options that we have? Is it all about wind and all about solar?
In many ways, a lot of it is about wind and solar. There are so many different visions of how we can transition away from fossil fuels to a low carbon and hopefully net zero global economy. If you just look at one high profile scenario, the International Energy Agency's net zero pathway that was released earlier this year, you can see that solar and wind are growing at about a 20 to 30-fold factor from today to what we expect them to provide in terms of electricity generation by mid-century, by 2050. And together they form less than 10% of global electricity generation at the moment. But by 2050, the IEA shows that they could be more like 70 to 80% of electricity generation. And that's in a context where that generation has increased about 4-fold on today's levels. So electricity is the low carbon energy vector of the future, if you like, and solar and wind are, I think, undeniably the generation sources that will dominate electricity generation going forward.
If we look at the general picture of energy crisis, quote unquote, vis-a-vis the agenda setting for Glasgow COP26, how should we reconcile the two very different directions of discussion? Changhua.
That's a very timely sort of question on the table. I think, China's power shortage, I wouldn't really call that energy crisis yet. I think it's a power shortage or energy crunch, and coal in particular in China. Europe actually has been experiencing the sort of gas sort of shortage there as well. And basically saying, yes, of course, on one side, the global community, including Europe and China, have been championing the agenda in terms of, switching away from fossil fuels and investing heavily into solar, wind, or non-fossil fuel energies there. But somehow in that context, we probably didn't really pay adequate, attention or, in terms of energy security as well as resilience, particularly through the COVID, recovery. And somehow, actually, we've been living in it. I think that's a good lesson to be learned, and hopefully somehow, what this topic will be also brought up, on the table at COP26, so that we'll be able to address this carbon neutrality transition, or I call it global clean energy revolution, in a sort of integrated, holistic manner, so that we'll be able to have much stronger energy resilience, energy security, well integrated or embedded actually in the decarbonization process.
That's an interesting way to put it. Diana, would you agree with that way that Changhua just framed?
Yes, absolutely. We are close to environmental disasters, and we need to act soon. On the other hand, I think this energy crisis, which is coming up, is giving us a major opportunity, because first it highlighted to us that we do have to ramp up investments in energy infrastructure as well, because that's one of the problems, that we have a major gap in energy infrastructure investments, because investors have been more and more worried to invest into the fossil infrastructures, but it has not been yet sufficient, the investment in the alternative infrastructures. On the other hand, it's also a major opportunity, because whenever energy prices are up, then it's even more cost effective to invest into alternative energy forms, since these come with high investment costs, but at the same time, then their operating costs are low. So supplying these energy sources is low, so it gives a rise to higher profit margins.
Yeah, but who will pay the bill? I mean, that is the issue, isn't it? I mean, Jeremy, you see that also in Europe as well. Many European countries are apparently having an energy crisis. But so who will pay the bill? Will the government pay the bill? Will the business pay the bill? Or the individuals and families pay the bill? Will the families be eager to pay the bill? That is the question. AJ, you are in Europe as well. What is your take? Would you like to pay the bill?
There is a need to switch now, and there will, in some cases, be some upfront costs to that. There'll be lots of savings and multiple benefits further down the track, and actually available to us quite soon, in terms of reducing our energy bills if we get more energy efficient, for example, in terms of reducing this global blight of air pollution that's associated with burning fossil fuels. All of these co-benefits have not yet, I think, being emphasized enough. And when there's more information about them, and that information is forthcoming now and starting to be more widespread, I think that people will understand that this isn't just about additional cost. This is about a very, very sound investment, a down payment on a much safer and cleaner future. And I think that if that's conveyed in an honest and evidence-based way, then people will, in some cases, be prepared to pay a little bit more upfront to reap those benefits.
AJ, I love this, what you call the evidence-based way. But one thing is very clear. There's likely to be a time difference when we are doing this transition, which means might be 1 or 2 years or even a couple of years. That's about the term of a politician in the presidential office. So will policymakers go with that? Those that are coming to Glasgow COP26 for the summit, will the leaders go with that? That's also the question. AJ, would you like to answer that?
I think politicians whose time horizon is only 1 or 2 years will lose their credibility. I think particularly younger generations will not let them get away with only talking about the next 1 or 2 years when those younger generations are looking at their future, their own children's futures, and so on and so forth. And we've seen that. We've seen so many younger people bringing court cases against, governments that aren't doing enough, against major fossil fuel companies that aren't doing enough. So the tide is turning, and I think that the sort of recent historical experience of only caring about what gets you elected, in the next 1 or 2 years is starting to ring a little hollow now. I think that climate change has undergone a step change, if you like, in being so high up people's agendas that they understand that there's a need for a more long-term responsible type of politics and governance. And so I think that we will really see that as a strong force going forward.
Will that understanding coming from AJ, Jianyu, be able to help us go through this most difficult transition process? And by the way, we do not even know how long this process will be.
I think, human beings really surrender themselves to the pricing signal, to the force of market. And right now we have, billions of the dollars available in the financial market. We should really try to orient them to this transition. We have demonstrated one of probably the best instrument out of that human ingenuity is the carbon market, and to put the price on carbon so that those who are willing to commit to the reduction earlier and more, that they can be rewarded by the price of the carbon market so that they can make a contribution to the future generations while also making a profit for themselves.
Whether this kind of energy crunch, as it's been described, that we're going through at the moment, is that the first significant bump on what's going to be a very bumpy road in the journey towards carbon neutrality? Because it seems some people think we're already paying the cost for those investments, or we haven't gone fast enough. Is that just one of the bumps we're going to have to get used to, Deanna?
Absolutely. And I'm afraid I would also already count the pandemic here as well. So unfortunately, this is the new normal, the era of crisis. This is coming because unfortunately, as a result of climate change, as a result of the biodiversity crisis, and because our economy is so much not in line with this whole global resources that we are living in, we are going to face more and more different types of crises. So I think this is what also an answer to a previous question, and when we are thinking about costs, I think it's really important to understand that we cannot get out of this problem without costs. Even if we don't act now on the energy transition, then the costs are going to come either as in the form of adaptation, or if we don't adapt, then the cost will come in terms of suffering. So certainly there are going to be these different crises and bumpy roads. On the other hand, I think the crucial issue is that we need to understand that change has always happened. None of the economy has always been constant. And although we are very worried about the energy transition, but everything is in transition. Our economies are anyway transitioning to a more digital era, a more service-based economy. All we need to do is simply ride this wave and accelerate these different processes.
In the political discussions that happen, do people talk about absolute zero and getting towards absolute zero, or is everybody just saying net zero is the only way because we know there are some industries, there are some sectors we just can't decarbonize in time?
Yeah, just very, very briefly on that. Yes, it's well recognized that it will be very hard technologically and economically to get rid of all of the last bit of emissions from certain sectors. We're talking about agriculture here, we're talking about some heavy or energy-intensive or carbon-intensive industrial manufacturing, perhaps cement, some chemicals, some iron and steel. Therefore, we do have to prepare for that by having some carbon dioxide removal technologies available to us so that we can get to a genuine zero state of emissions.
I was interested, Jianyu Zhang, that you were talking about using economic levers, basically pricing, And I know that China is experimenting this. How is it going in China when it comes to carbon markets and how it's developing? And how do you see that moving forward? What's the sort of 10 or 20-year vision in terms of development of carbon markets, Dr. Zhang?
Yeah, I think people in our community all know that China just launched the largest carbon market in the world, about 4.2 billion tons on July the 16th. So far, the market is going smoothly, but slowly. I think that's not a surprise, because if you compare that to the initial stage of EU ETS, initial stage of the AB32 in California, they have all gone through the initial stage. But I want to expand that my definition of a market-based solutions a little bit larger, because if you look at what China's response to the most recent energy crisis, so to speak, as we're discussing here, one of, I think, really smart phenomena of that is Chinese government just opened up the long-lagged power sector reform, that they lift the cap for the pricing of the electricity being capped, for many, many years. I can't even remember. And I think that's really good. That sent a strong signal to both the producers and also to the consumers. So for example, right now they're saying any of the high intensive energy consuming sectors, the price of the electricity that they will be sold to is not capped at all. So I think that sent a really strong signal to those energy intensive industries that either they need to adopt much intensive energy savings measures so they can survive, or they really need to start to think about alternatives. And also, I think this sent a signal to the individual households of the normal consumers. Also think about your consumption behavior. I think what I want to emphasize here is that there's never going to be the perfect solution, but we as policymakers really need to create a paradigm that every single stakeholder can be brought into and also play a role as part of the solution. And I see no better solutions than those market-based instruments that can really serve as the platform to bring all of them in.
I think there's a concern, though, amongst consumers, certainly here in Europe, that they are the ones who are going to end up paying for this transition. And then I think there's also another concern, which is that this carbon neutral concept is one which is a kind of smokescreen for some of the creative accounting that we might see in the world of tax, for example. What's your view on that, Changhua Wu, in terms of the... is there a kind of a smokescreen there with carbon neutrality? And is it, in fact, the case that the consumer will just pay at the end of the day? It's just going to get more expensive for us?
Well, I agree with you to a certain extent that there are problems in reality when we talk about carbon neutrality, right? Even from accounting perspective, right? How do we make sure, 1 ton of carbon is neutralized, really counts as 1 ton, of carbon? From that perspective, I think, yes, that's going to require more work, particularly from research community, scientific community, because it's also partly linked, largely linked with the nature-based solutions. Because on the other side, besides carbon, we do have this loss of nature, loss of biodiversity challenge there. So carbon neutrality somehow creates, even though there are problems, but somehow it also has become a tool to connect actually the decarbonization and the nature protection there. Consumers have to pay. I think everyone has to pay, and so it's a pricing or a cost of transition that has to be shared by everyone, in the society, government, business, individuals, all in. There's no other way. So because we all consumers, we're all contributing to the increasing of carbons there. But I do want to, sort of redirect a little bit back to the question you asked Deanna early on. I think actually a couple of things to understand the politics, and also this is sort of short-term, long-term, this is sort of variation or disruption of the energy crunch. I think politics complicates things, and that's reflected actually at the local level, national level, and also at the global level. And that part really it has to be addressed. And so, from technology perspective, from policy perspective, you start to see all the things coming together. But somehow a major factor that's sort of slowing the process is the politics, right? And if politics is not well addressed at all kinds of levels, including at the global level, geopolitical level, we know for sure that's going to be becoming a major barrier to slow down the process there. By saying that, I do want to direct it to the positive side. I think the ball is already rolling. And with all the challenges around us, we had to figure out how to address them. If you look at the last year in particular, if you look at the newly installed energy capacity, 90% of them globally is renewable energy, not fossil fuel energy there. And in that context, actually, if you look at the role of China, China literally has been playing its role in terms of industrializing, manufacturing the products, equipments, and units. 70% solar and wind units produced by China, and 50% of the electric vehicles last year brought on the market from China. If you look at the batteries supplied, 70% globally to China. So in a nutshell, I think, yes, it's complicated with all the short-term, all these crunches and disruptions. We have to bear with that. In the meantime, actually, we do need to look into the more promising future. The ball is already rolling.
We want to be optimistic, but the question is there are practical issues that we have to face, and we have to give solutions before we talk about the bigger and beautiful pictures. So one of the things I have noticed about your answers is how should we reconcile another thing? One is that China is looking at the market. Carbon market is one great example. Not putting cap on the electricity price tag anymore, particularly for those energy-intensive industry, is another example. But there are other examples that it seems that the international community just did not understand, particularly, let's say, maybe from our European friends. Jianyu, for example, about coal. Why China is putting so much emphasis on coal? At this point, there's also investigation about exactly what should be the coal price in China and why there was a apparent energy crisis in China because of the coal price rising. So how should we see these very different directions of the story? We have to look at all of them as one story. Jianyu.
Well, actually, surprise, what you just described of this sort of coal challenge is also a good manifest of the policy that China's government has been putting into place on capping of the coal and to reduce coal consumption. Let me walk you out. It used to be that there's the production of the small and all those dangerous small coal mines, that their coal production was not part of the national statistics. They provide partially the supply to this whole supply and demand balance. And because the central government's institution of the coal cap policy nationwide, and because of this whole campaign on reducing of the coal production, particularly from the small coal mines, we actually have a shortage of the supply. And that itself contributes to the most recent energy crunch that we're describing here. And the other part, I think the policy, the Chinese government, they're using both the hammer and also the carrot. And carrot, I mean here, is really trying to, at the fastest speed and the maximum power, to encourage and introduce innovations in the development of renewable technologies. Changhua just mentioned about all those 70% of the solar panels produced by China. And I can also point to a 90% reduction of the cost of the solar panels. So it's really a balance issue. And I think we have all been discussing here is we need to figure out what is the smoothest way of transition in this whole demand and supply relationship. So just focusing on one part of that, for example, just focusing on the reducing of coal would not be the best solution. And you need to look at both sides.
But we do need to clean up coal, though, right? We need to clean up coal quickly, and how you're going to clean up coal quickly is through carbon capture and storage, which is already happening. So how do you fix the coal problem? Because coal is just so much last century's technology, but it's what's powering all of this growth and development. How are you going to clean it up?
Well, certainly, you have those regulations. I mentioned about the coal cap policy the government has introduced. There's the carbon market, which will naturally, put a further burden on the coal-fired power plants, which is the sector that was first started with the cap of the total emission and in the carbon market. But I want to point out that what focus should not just be on the coal itself, it should be on the entire train of fossil fuel, right? And remember, natural gas is only 10% cleaner in terms of carbon emission from the coal. So it's not just the issue of the coal. We need to look at the issue in its entirety because it's the global climate crisis that we're trying to resolve.
I remember my coworker Jeremy just mentioned one phrase which to me intellectually interesting, that the coal issue is a last century problem. That's exactly the nature of the problem. Yes, indeed, that was the last century for the industrialized economies. But it is a current issue for the developing countries. That's what China is talking about. And that's many of the developing countries are facing right now as well if they use coal as some of the major source. So Changhua, to you, also on that question, the coal issue vis-a-vis the overall whole picture of roadmap and goal setting.
I think we already have that blueprint on the table, even from Chinese national government's commitments in achieving carbon neutrality. We literally see a few trends. One, the coal, contribution in the overall energy structure will continue to decline, right? So when we get to roughly 2060 or before that, actually, non-fossil fuels will account for 80% and more of China's energy, structure there. But I do want to point it to a different, switching a little bit actually to the bigger picture, which I see more fundamental. It's more like the energy is a system, right? And sort of partly echoing what Jianyu said. So coal, of course, unfortunately, we have to address as soon as possible. That's already in the plan. But more importantly, actually, China is literally redesigning its national energy system that has to be built upon, or non-fossil fuel centered, this new infrastructure there. That's going to be built upon actually the converging of communication technology, renewable energy technology, as well as clean transportation and the mobility technologies there. So when the things coming together, this energy system will offer the opportunity for all the other elements like agriculture, like different sectors, different facilities actually to plug in. So that's going to be the fundamental piece of the puzzle. Probably COP26 wouldn't really pay too much attention to because internationally we are sort of obsessed with the coal issues there. But actually, China is moving, in the right direction and really driving the fundamental shift of the energy system.
I think the question, a lot of the questions come back to what are in consumers' minds, because in fact that's at the end of the day that comes down to votes, and it's what gets politicians elected. And we, as consumers say, okay, renewables sound great. That sounds like a wonderful, clean future. But, what if the sun's not shining, the wind's not blowing? We know energy storage is a massive problem. AJ, how are we going to fix that? Because at the moment you said, we're at 10% renewables. We want to get to 70 or 80% renewables. How are we going to store all this energy?
Yeah, I mean, these are interesting questions, but to me they feel like questions and concerns from more like 5 to 10 years ago, actually. I think that many of the concerns around renewables and their perceived reliability, particularly the weather-dependent renewables like wind and solar, the availability of storage, those concerns are now fading away because we've had this, as Dr. Zhang alluded to before, this miraculous cost reduction in not just solar panels, but also wind turbines, offshore wind, for example. Its cost reduction journey has been arguably even more remarkable in the last few years than solar. And we're seeing similar things happening with grid-level battery storage. We're seeing huge investments and huge excitement in longer-term storage options like hydrogen, for example. And so we have immense amounts of innovation and ideas going on across the world now. And actually, there are countries that are demonstrating that you can get to very high proportions of weather-dependent renewable generation. Take Denmark, for example, which is now at 50%, maybe more of its electricity coming from wind. It's very successfully and reliably managed that through a whole host of solutions, whether it's interconnection with neighboring markets, whether it's storage solutions. And, it's not just sitting back and looking at that. It's now planning 100% renewable generation.
No, but isn't that basically because the Danes are generating wind, but then they're selling it to the Germans at a nice price, and then when the wind's not blowing, they're buying energy made by coal from the Germans? Isn't that not how it works?
Well, they can interconnect with neighbouring markets, and they don't just interconnect with Germany. There's interconnection with other Nordic countries as well. So there's a lot of hydro, for example, coming in as well. And, the German coal issue is another question. It's, I think, another example of this bumpy road that Diana was pointing to that we're going to have to weather over the coming years. But I think that it's very, very technically feasible and being demonstrated not just in theoretical modelling exercises, but in all sorts of markets now, that you can have very high proportions of renewables supplying electricity in a very reliable way. And we're only at the beginning, actually, of the journey of looking at the vast sort of array of solutions that can help provide greater flexibility in electricity generation systems, electricity demand systems, and so on. We'll be plugging our cars in to charge in a few years' time, and the batteries in those cars will be feeding electricity back to the grid. There are already a number of electricity companies that are piloting those vehicle-to-grid technologies. So our cars will be contributing as sort of mini power stations to the grid and providing storage in that way. That's just one of a small number of examples of how we, really understand how to do this and get to high penetrations of renewables. So many analyses wouldn't have produced these scenarios of high renewable penetration and dependence of electricity generation in the future on renewables if they didn't have a good understanding of how these renewables could be effectively and reliably and cost-effectively integrated into electricity markets.
But this is an infrastructure transformation we are talking about. AJ, I totally go with you, and I love the idea of all meeting the target. But who will pay the bill? I always ask this question because particularly for the developing countries, the infrastructure change means a huge cost to them, particularly at this time of a pandemic. So how will the international community, particularly with COP26, be able to deal with these problems? When we talk about the future, we need to have a road to get there for everyone, not just a few, everyone. AJ, briefly, before I go to others.
You make a really good point about the emerging or the developing countries, and there is a huge opportunity with ever-decreasing cost renewables there to help many of these countries leapfrog, if you like, and avoid sort of costly extensions of what are in many places
unreliable. What do you mean by many? Many is how many?
Many in terms of the number of countries or the number of people affected?
In terms of the percentage of the population that we can help with the current technology that you say would not cost a lot for them to change the infrastructure.
Well, just as an example, we know that there are something like 800 million people still lacking access to electricity. And if you were to extend electricity grids to them, not only would you be doing that using very carbon-intensive technologies such as coal or gas-fired power stations, but you'd also be providing them with quite unreliable electricity access. Now, we have alternatives now. We have off-grid solutions or mini-grids based on solar, wind, batteries, renewable systems, and they are actually in many cases proving more reliable, and they're coming down in cost. We need to get the financing and business models right. And so I think that leads on to my second quick point, which is an extremely important thing that you allude to, which is how is this going to be funded? And that, of course, is on the table for COP26,
right.
This 100 billion of international finance. And we do need to see that flow, and we do need to see that grow, because emerging and developing countries can't do this on their own. They do need considerable support from the industrialized countries to really walk the walk now and provide them with that financial.
I don't want to be the one that provides the bad news. But ladies and gentlemen, we need to look at the reality. Some of the earlier bills already promised by earlier conferences have not been paid to the developing countries when they are trying to do their infrastructure transformation. So how can we trust the COP26 be able to do that? I want to be upbeat, but that's a reality we need to face. Diana.
there are tremendous debts that still need to be paid by the developed countries, because certainly we are the most responsible for the problem. On the other hand, I think what's also important to say is, or to see, is not always only focus on these costs, this new cost, because especially in developing countries, there's this tremendous infrastructure development going to take place in any case. Also in the developed countries, but especially in developing countries. Simply the question is this infrastructure going to be developed in the 20th century way, as Jeremy put it, and many of you phrased it, or more in the 21st century way, which is it's also a question of finance, but also a question of technology transfer or just innovation.
Absolutely.
And I think we should approach it a little bit from this perspective, that yes, of course, it's cost, but at the same time, it's also a lot of opportunities.
Can we expect the COP26 be able to achieve that much? Everything on the list that we mentioned earlier. How can we have a pragmatic vision for COP26 so that we make sure, everybody makes sure, it's going to be one step further, not a big step back? That's very important. Jianyu, you have questions? You have suggestions?
Well, I think certainly we're going to have, if not the most, but a very challenging COP, not only because of the still ongoing pandemic situation, but I think the global consensus has yet to be fully established. And I think the finance issue we just mentioned, the gap between the 100 billion that was committed, and I think by the most recent OECD survey, they only found about 80 billion of that, even in creative accounting practice, that was being delivered.
Another issue is about what this COP26 upcoming is likely to be remembered of. At this time, when our program is being broadcast, the leaders are in their meetings. So what kind of responsibility they're carrying for their generation and the generations to come? I think they need to answer those questions very seriously. Our guests already answered those questions very seriously with their own expertise. It's now on their shoulder. So I would like to thank all of our guests for such an insightful and engaging conversation. Indeed, in the race against the climate change, every fraction of a degree by which the global temperature rises counts. Every country, every business must bring the best that they have to this race with the shared goal of winning it, hopefully.
It's been a pleasure working with you on this way, and we here at Euronews and CGTN will continue to bring you the very latest in news and international analysis on climate change issues, global efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and with that great far-off goal in mind of reaching net zero. Thanks to Diana Erga-Vosatz from the Central European University and AJ Gambier from Imperial College London, and goodbye from Euronews in Lyon, France.
Thank you, Jeremy, Diana, and AJ. And many thanks also to our guests, Zhang Jianyu from the BRI Green Development Institute and Wu Changhua from Jeremy Rifkin Office. You can watch us on CGTN app or on YouTube. I'm Tian Wei. You can also find me on Twitter and Facebook. Goodbye from Beijing, China. Thanks for watching. Bye.